where we have come to in the gospel is following the parables. We have this story. And if you remember, I commented that the parables are doorways into what the reign of God is about. They could be taken literally at face value, but the invitation of the parable is to step into its world and see things differently. Sometimes what we expect, we're caught off guard and are surprised. Sometimes what we think is the norm, that the parable reverses the norm and puts us down perhaps in a very uncomfortable place, a place that's not familiar to us, a place of uncertainty and anxiety, and in that we might be experiencing what the reign of God is about. And so again, we have to think that it's not just the literal that we have to be in touch with, but also this metaphorical world, if you will, but metaphorical in the sense that it allows us to expand our imaginations and awarenesses. So when we come to this story today, my first thought about it is, now come on, 5 loaves and 2 fishes. How is it possible that that would feed the thousands? And by the way, not counting the women and the children, right? So here's an example where the gospel itself is already intending to exclude some. So there were more than 5,000 there, but we just won't mention women and children. How is that possible? Perhaps the bread, because you just keep, piecing little pieces off. 2 fish, I don't know how you're going to multiply them. And notice in the story, it doesn't tell us past the mention of them where they are and how that works. And let me tell you, if they're fish out of the Lake of Galilee, forget it. They're tilapia and filled with bones, and we've been at a restaurant in Galilee, and they serve the whole fish. Well, it just turns my stomach. Growing up in the Midwest, all we had was fish sticks out of the freezer, and so I have no taste at all, although Steve has helped me develop some taste for fish. So that part of the story we can just bracket and set aside. But this bread story, and I think about it because, if we start at the literal level again, it's that problem that we have. How is it possible that bread is going to be able to feed those thousands? But on top of it, if we were reading Mark's gospel at this point, that for the next 3 weeks, 4 weeks, we would be reading John's long soliloquy and discourse on the bread of life and how Jesus is considered to be the bread of life. And we use that term frequently to talk about Jesus. Jesus is the bread of life. Well, frankly speaking, again, that I find it difficult at the literal level to think how bread, and remember now, we're not talking about like the bread that we use here. If we're in the Middle East, more likely it's pita, or depending upon which culture you're in, that it's going to be rice cakes, or, we ate at an Indian restaurant yesterday, and they had that wonderful Indian bread that was kind of coated with some olive oil or whatever it would have been on it. It was just wonderful. I could eat that alone. But you see, literally speaking, that bread isn't going to really do much for you except fill you up on calories and carbohydrates, right? And if you're on a special diet these days, that's not anything good. So bread is verboten on your diet plan. So it makes it difficult if we're only working on the literal level to grasp some sense of what's going on here. And perhaps this story is much like the parables, where it invites us not just to take it literally, but to consider a much larger frame of reference, and I'll get to that in a moment. I don't think I've mentioned it, although I may have told the story several times. I am a super big fan of Stargate SG-1. and Stargate Atlantis and anything Stargate. Because it just impresses me such that in our limited world of technology, even at that time, and those were about 15 years ago, so even the technology of 15 years ago has developed quite a bit since then, that to imagine, well, here it is. It's like I gave the example of Alice through the looking glass, right? Well, think of this huge Stargate that is able to connect with a wormhole that transports people millions and millions of miles in seconds to another galaxy in another universe. And so you step through it, and I just always laugh, in the early shows, they just can't quite figure out how they get dematerialized and then manage to get put back together again at the other end. It's like the unanswered question in all of the Star Trek movies and shows as to how that's possible. Because I can just see people getting connected, foot here, head here. It's just like one of those things that it's impossible in our limited understanding of science and physics and all of that today. Perhaps, and that's the invitation, perhaps in some future point. And it's always interesting, at least in the Stargate series, that they rarely encounter a civilization that doesn't look like them. That they always go to a planet where there's people looking like them. In Star Trek, at least they have these bizarre figures and characters, and there's just really weird people showing up in Star Trek. But in Stargate, they're basically, except for one civilization, the Nox, if you've ever seen that story. And Steve and I laugh every time we see an episode on the Nox, because they are the hippies of their world. They walk around and they basically got twigs in their hair. You can just imagine, But so the Stargate people just look down on them. It's like these are primitive people, but the Nox call the Stargate people primitive people. And they have an ability to heal and to have an awareness of the earth that they're on, the planet that they're on. They have an awareness and they have capabilities that seem to far go beyond anything that the Stargate people have. And the last one that we just saw just the other day was indeed, they do. They have much, much more advanced technology. I tell you that because, you see, if we just stick with the literal world, then we never can have an imaginative leap of faith, if you will, to step up to the event horizon on the Stargate and to step into it and get transported into another world. That's exactly what the parables do. And so in doing that today, it's like, how is it possible that amount of bread, 5 loaves, can feed thousands of people? And you see, if we stay on the literal level, it's never going to be possible. But if we advance beyond that literal into that imaginative and creative world, so I began to think about it, about even the word bread. And I didn't do a due diligence in looking at what the word in Greek is in the text. But, there's ways that we use that word even today, right? We use it to apply to money, right? Bread. Do you have enough bread, right? Money. Maybe that's a, street word. I don't know. I never used it that way. But, so that, you see, if you use that word connected to that idea, then you open a world that suggests that money is what's going to sustain you, give you access, provide support for you, enables you to live in the world. So that money as bread does everything that real bread on a dinner table, as a side, allows you to do. So expanding the horizon and awareness of that suggests that this bread is meant to sustain, enable access, give you a certain degree of power and ability that you wouldn't have without it. That's what the money, bread as looked at in terms of money. But it's also, and I hinted at it, that if you consider that, I've been to Spain. Oh my gosh. The breads of Spain are just incredible. And when you've grown up in the Midwest on Wonder Bread that has probably absolutely no nutritional value, and of course they would put on the outside cover, right? Enriched with vitamin D and B and Agnin and Z, and so that it's okay, right? That's all I had. And so going to Spain where there's this dense, heavy, crusty bread, it's like, wow, that's something that you can sink your teeth into and know that you're getting something more than air. Or traveling to the Middle East, and you have one of those pita breads that I just love, where you split it open and you stuff things into the pita bread. And you could go into a street vendor, and it's just stuffed with French fries and marinated lamb and garden tomatoes that are so full of acid they just burn your mouth. And then you take that pita bread and you put a little tzatziki sauce on it. I'm getting everybody hungry, I hope. You put some tzatziki sauce over it, and you just bite into it, and it all falls all over the front of you. It's one of those kinds of breads. Rice cakes, I don't know. And to be honest, when I was in Asia, I can't remember, I don't think that there really isn't a sense of a bread. But rice itself is the staff of life for them. In fact, I saw stories about India is getting ready to put a ban on exporting of Indian rice because there isn't enough rice for the Indians to have in India. And so it tells us that that's the stuff that you put on the plate first, and then you pile on that stuff on top of it, right? Even Chinese food. What Chinese restaurant doesn't give you a box of rice that you can use on the bottom of the plate, and you put all those wonderful vegetables and stuff on top of it? And the same with Indian food. So rice then isn't formed in a cake or a bread, but it becomes the foundation. Think of that word, the foundation for your meal, if you will. But you see, again, not just that meal, and here stepping through the Stargate into another world, that if you take those words, the staff of life, sustenance, access, and the stuff that holds things together, and now expand it out a little bit. So that when in the Christian tradition we talk about Jesus as the bread of life, and I remember growing up in the Catholic tradition, I happened to be absent the day that, as first graders, we were going through the steps on what we were going to do for First Communion. And those who grew up Catholic, remember, all we had were those flat wafers that had absolutely no taste to them whatsoever. And I remember the nun saying to me, now, because you couldn't touch it, because we believed that host was the, quote, real body of Jesus. And therefore, if you even, this is going to sound terrible, and good thing the kids are all occupied over here, that if you bit into that, you were crunching the bones of Jesus. That's what they told us. So you were absolutely scared to death of it. And that host, dry host, can you imagine the first thing that happened when it went into your mouth? It stuck to the roof of my mouth. And in doing that, you're kind of going, because you couldn't touch it to get it off. And you think of, wow, if that's the experience of Jesus as the bread of life, wow, that doesn't say very much at all, does it? It doesn't say much when even what we use today for communion, that it's like, how is that going to sustain me? And here I want us to consider that it's easy enough to simply at that literal level, but the literal level here is the spiritual level, that this sustains me spiritually. Well, how far do you really, can you go with that? I mean, does that, it's sort of like thinking again of the Stargate, you know, that big circle that dials in, here it is, dialing in to some address, they talk about it, that takes you somewhere, and you really have no clue where it's going to take you unless you put that great big huge machine that has a cannon on it and a camera on it, and you send that through, and if it looks okay, then maybe you will step through the Stargate and go to that planet or universe, but you really don't have much awareness of the whole world that it exists on. That in thinking about just that literal, the spiritual level here of Jesus as the bread of life and why we hunger for it is, let's face it, it's like dialing into our salvation. That we put an address in, and meaning you got to push this button on the right doctrine, push this button on the right discipline, push this button on the right practice, push this button on the right behavior, and then all of those click in, lock in, and you can step through the Stargate, the event horizon, and get yourself to heaven. Well, wouldn't that be great? We'd avoid all kinds of trouble and all kinds of pain and all kinds of suffering and all kinds of things if that's how it worked. And some people think that that's what it is. I remember in the Catholic circles, even today, the bishops are concerned that there's a loss of a sense of, quote, Eucharistic devotion, meaning people have lost a sense of the sacredness and holiness of communion itself. And so the invitation is to simply place yourself in a passive adoration of what the bread is all about, so that somehow or another, by meditating on Jesus who is present in the bread, that automatically will make you a better person. Well, okay, I suppose that happens for some. But you see, you said this one time before. Dorothy Day said that if you really want to see the face of Jesus in communion, you first have to see the face of Jesus in the poor. Do you see, for the guests that come next week, do we see the face of Jesus in them? Considering what many of them look like. You know, bad teeth, dirty, smelly. How is that Jesus? So you see, if we keep it on the spiritual level, then we're never able to translate it into realizing that this story today is about taking what we have received, sustenance, access, motivation, taking that as bread and taking it into the world. And while we may break off a piece of bread and give it, it's more than that. It's much, much more than that. That's what the Stargate people realize about the Knox people, is finally at the end of that episode, the Knox who are tired of being said that they look primitive and are just bizarre hippies in some future world, and they really do look like hippies from what was that festival out in the Woodstock? Some hippie out in Woodstock, that they say, we'll show you who we are. And there, floating above the planet, is this magnificent city. And the Stargate people are humbled because here they had judged the Knox as primitive people, only to discover that the Knox were far more advanced than they were. And they were humbled by that. Oh, so there we are. Notice in the discussion, the disciples go, you better send these people back home where they can find food on their own tables. We don't have much of anything. 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. Jesus says, feed them yourselves. And they go, how do we do that? And finally, Jesus takes it in some miraculous way that, and here's the catch in the story, that moves us past just the literal to this metaphorical Stargate world. They don't just have a little bit left over. They've got 12 baskets left over. They've got, does that sound like the parable again? There's more than you could ever imagine. So for the bread that we talk about as Jesus, that if this provides access to something, whatever it may be, or provides sustenance at whichever level that might be, provides us with motivation, meaning once we have the energy that we're able to accomplish a lot, that if this bread, beyond the literal piece of bread, comes in abundance, then you see the invitation is, and maybe this is what we have to work against, and it's not anybody here in this room, it might be our parents, or mostly our parents. Even at my age, at 70, my parents would be in their late 90s. So anybody in the previous generation, or at the upper end of the baby boomers, lived through a time of scarcity. And the scarcity was the Great Depression. And the story in my family was that my grandfather, who worked as red cap at Union Station in St. Louis, and many of the regular people that would go through the station on their way to wherever, knew that he had 4 kids at home and a wife at home and an aunt, a great aunt at home. They would give him extra ration cards so that he could provide. Obviously, his job at the train station didn't provide enough, that they would give him cards so that he could have enough for his family. What do we give that's enough for people? What's the bread that we take with us for the journey? Because you see, we're on a journey. We're on a journey. Not to heaven, folks. We're on a journey empowering the reign of God to come about in our midst. Empowering the reign of God, where part of what I was thinking about when Pat was sharing is that almost every single one of those laws that are being brought to the legislatures all have to do with what? Restricting health care. What the hell kind of country are we that says that we're going to restrict health care to people who need it, regardless of whether they're straight, gay, or trans? What a horrible, horrible world and message that sends to the rest of the world, that we're going to not let you get the health care you need simply because you're trans. Not that any of those legislatures knows what that means. What's the bread, as Pat invited the children, what's the bread that we need to take to the world to help them step through that stargate into a world where they see things differently. But more than just see things differently, act differently. That's the invitation of this story today.